My name is Claire. I'm 27 years old, and this story happened to me 4 years ago in a small Airbnb house in the suburbs of New York. I've never been this terrified in my life, and even now I can't stop thinking about what happened that night. It was a cold October evening. I was on a business trip and needed a place to stay for a few days. Instead of booking a hotel, I opted for a more comfortable alternative. The Airbnb house I found looked perfect in the photos. It was a cozy, 2-story home with warm decor, and the price was surprisingly affordable. When I arrived, I received a message from the owner. "Enjoy your stay, but whatever you do, don't go into the basement after 11 p.m. I found the warning strange but ignored it as I stepped inside. The house looked just like the photos. A comfy couch, warm lights, bookshelves lined with novels. It felt like the perfect getaway. Exhausted from the day, I decided to take a shower and go to bed early. Things get strange after 11 p.m. After showering, I was in the kitchen grabbing a quick snack when I heard a weird noise. It came from the lower part of the house, the basement. It sounded metallic, like something falling behind a fridge. I brushed it off, thinking old houses often make strange noises, but the sound became more distinct, more rhythmic. It was as if someone or something was banging on a metal pipe. Clink, clink, clink. I glanced at my phone. It was 11:15 p.m. The owner's message flashed through my mind, and a chill ran down my spine. Trying to shake it off, I walked to the basement door. I bent down to peek through the small gap under the door. All I could see was pitch-black darkness. Probably just the wind, I thought. But just then the metallic noise stopped and was replaced by something else. Footsteps, heavy, deliberate steps. Curiosity or survival. Despite the fear creeping in, my curiosity got the better of me. I turned on the flashlight on my phone and cracked the door open. A cold, damp draft hit my face. The staircase leading down to the basement looked endless in the dim light. I carefully descended a few steps, my flashlight illuminating the old wooden stairs. The air grew heavier, filled with the smell of dampness and something metallic. As I reached the bottom, I swung my flashlight around. There was an old chair in the corner and scattered toys covered in dust. But then I heard the footsteps again. This time they came from right behind me. Terrified, I spun around, but there was nothing there. My heartbeat thundered in my chest. When I turned back, I noticed something new in the room, a figure sitting on the chair that hadn't been there before. Shadows of the past. As I stepped closer, I thought it was just a mannequin. It wore tattered, dusty clothes and sat motionless. But its face, or what was supposed to be a face, was haunting. It was half human, half wax-like, grotesque and unnatural. Its chest was torn open as though someone had tried to rip it apart. From another corner of the basement, I suddenly heard a child's laughter, high-pitched and chilling. My flashlight darted toward the sound, but nothing was there. I turned to leave, but when I glanced back at the mannequin, its head had shifted. It was now facing me. The fight to escape. Screaming, I bolted for the stairs. As I climbed, something grabbed my ankle. The grip was cold and sharp, its nails digging into my skin. I kicked and struggled, my phone slipping out of my hand, plunging the basement into darkness. I clawed at the railing and dragged myself up, finally slamming the basement door shut and locking it behind me. Gasping for air, I collapsed onto the floor. But then I heard it, the whisper. Faint but unmistakable, coming from the other side of the door. "You'll come back. This place never lets go." Aftermath. I sat in the corner of the living room until the sun rose, paralyzed with fear. At first light, I grabbed my things and left the house, not daring to look back. I messaged the Airbnb owner, but they never replied. A few days later, I checked, and the listing for the house was gone. I don't know what or who was in that basement, but I've never been the same since. The memory of that thing and its whisper still haunts me. One thing is for certain, I'll never ever open a basement door again. My name is Nathan. I'm 29 years old, and this happened last year while I was living in Chicago. I have never experienced fear like this in my entire life. It still haunts my dreams and keeps me awake at night. It was an ordinary Friday evening, and I was at my friend Jessica's house. The house was in an old neighborhood on the outskirts of the city. After dinner, Jessica had gone out to the store to pick up a few things, and I stayed behind, watching TV while waiting for her. The house was quiet, too quiet. Aside from Jessica's cat, there was no one else inside. It was nearing 11 p.m. and Jessica hadn't come back yet. I wasn't worried at first. The store was close by, and I figured she had just gotten distracted. But that silence, that God-forsaken silence, was unsettling. The sounds begin. I felt like something in the living room had moved. At first, I thought it was Jessica's cat, but the cat was right in front of me, curled up on the couch. So what had moved? I strained my ears. Faint footsteps echoed from upstairs. Jessica must be back, I thought. But then I realized I hadn't heard the front door open or close. The cat's fur suddenly bristled and it let out a low growl. That's when my heart began pounding like a drum. "Who's there?" I shouted, trying to sound confident, but my voice betrayed me. Of course, no one answered. The courage to go upstairs. I grabbed the metallic base of a lamp from the living room and cautiously made my way toward the stairs. My heart felt like it was about to leap out of my chest. The second floor was completely dark. Why hadn't Jessica turned on the lights? I stepped slowly up the creaking stairs, my hand gripping the makeshift weapon tightly. At the end of the hallway, light was spilling out from a partially open door. Jessica's bedroom. When I stepped inside, I saw the light was coming from her desk lamp. But as I took another step, I realized I wasn't alone in the room. Seeing it. In the corner, next to the bed, stood a figure. It looked human, but it had no face. No eyes, no nose, no mouth. Nothing. Just a flat, pale surface like a blank mask. I froze in place. The figure slowly turned its head toward me. I don't know how something with no features can see, but I felt its gaze pierce through me, freezing me to my core. I couldn't move. I couldn't even breathe. It took a single slow step toward me, the floor creaking faintly beneath its weight. Suddenly, a door slammed shut in the hallway behind me, snapping me out of my paralysis. I gathered every ounce of strength I had and ran. I flew down the stairs and out the front door, slamming it behind me as I bolted onto the street. Aftermath. Jessica found me a few minutes later, standing in the cold, clutching the lamp base, tears streaming down my face. "There's someone in the house!" I shouted, but when we went back inside, no one was there. Jessica didn't believe me. She still thinks I imagined it out of fear, but that faceless thing, it was real. I know it was, and sometimes I still feel it, not just in that house, everywhere. Wandering further, I came across a door that led to a staircase descending into the basement. The air grew heavier with every step I took, and the metallic scent intensified. At the bottom of the stairs, I found a stone circle etched into the floor, surrounded by melted candles and smeared with a dark tar-like substance. Symbols I couldn't recognize were carved into the walls. That's when I heard it. A faint, whispering sound, not quite human. It echoed off the stone walls, sending chills down my spine. I spun around, but there was no one there. The whispers seemed to come from everywhere and nowhere at once, guiding me toward the center of the circle. The moment I stepped into the circle, the ground trembled. Shadows stretched and twisted across the walls, forming human-like figures. I squeezed my eyes shut, praying this was a nightmare. The true horror begins. When I opened my eyes, I was no longer in the basement. I was in what looked like an underground labyrinth. The walls were ancient, carved from stone and marked with strange glowing symbols. As I wandered through the maze, I felt something following me. I could hear footsteps behind me, heavy and deliberate, but every time I turned around, the corridor was empty. My panic grew with each passing moment. Eventually, I stumbled into a room filled with bloody handprints smeared across the walls. In the center of the room, a man was chained to the floor. His eyes were closed, and he whispered something over and over. "You won't get out. It won't let you." Before I could ask him what he meant, the door slammed shut behind me. A guttural growl rumbled through the air, and a massive shadowy figure emerged from the darkness. It had no face, just a gaping mouth filled with jagged teeth. It stepped toward me, and I froze in terror. Summoning all my courage, I turned and ran. The labyrinth seemed to shift with every turn I took. Corridors changed, walls moved, and the exit always eluded me. But the shadow was relentless, its heavy footsteps echoing behind me. Finally, I saw a faint light in the distance. With every ounce of strength I had left, I sprinted toward it. When I reached the light, I found myself back in the mansion's entryway. Gasping for air, I bolted outside and jumped into my car, speeding away without looking back. But as I drove home, I noticed something chilling. The key was no longer in my pocket. The haunting never ends. That night, I couldn't sleep. My dreams were filled with the shadowy figure and the labyrinth's walls closing in around me. When I woke up, I found a small symbol carved into the doorframe of my bedroom, the same glowing symbol from the labyrinth. And last night I heard the whispers again. But this time, they weren't coming from the walls. They were coming from inside my room. Final note. By sharing this, I hope to rid myself of the fear, but it seems to have only gotten worse. Whatever was in that mansion, it's not finished with me yet. The Silent Watcher. My name is Sarah, and I was 24 when I moved to the small, quiet town of Ashford. I had just started my new job as a nurse at the local hospital and was eager to begin my new life. The town was picturesque, with its cobblestone streets, old houses, and lush green surroundings. Everyone seemed friendly enough, and the people there were warm and welcoming. But there was something off about Ashford, something I couldn't quite place. It was a Tuesday evening when I first saw him. I had just finished a long shift at the hospital and was walking home down the winding path that led to my small cottage. The streets were deserted, as usual, and the only sound I could hear was the rustling of the trees in the wind. The street lights flickered softly, casting shadows on the pavement. Then, from the corner of my eye, I saw a figure standing by the old oak tree at the end of the street. It was a man, tall and thin, dressed in a long black coat. He stood perfectly still, his face hidden in the shadows, but I felt his eyes on me. I quickened my pace, feeling a sense of unease settle in my stomach. As I passed the tree, I glanced at him again. He hadn't moved, but somehow his presence felt like an unspoken threat. His eyes were still watching me, and I couldn't shake the feeling that something wasn't right. I shook it off and hurried home, locking the door behind me as I entered. But even as I settled into bed that night, I couldn't stop thinking about the man. Who was he? Why was he standing there, staring at me? The next day. The following morning, I decided to ask around about the man. I stopped by the cafe on Main Street and struck up a conversation with the owner, Mrs. Jenkins. "Have you ever seen someone standing by the old oak tree late at night?" I asked casually, trying to sound nonchalant. Mrs. Jenkins frowned and looked around before leaning in closer. "You should be careful, dear. There's been talk of someone watching people from the shadows lately. Some folks think it's just a lonely man, but others, they think it's something else." I frowned, sensing she was holding back. "What do you mean?" She sighed, glancing nervously at the window. "Ashford's been here for centuries. It's always been a quiet place, but there are stories, strange happenings. People talk about a shadow that follows you if you're not careful. Someone or something that watches from the dark, waiting for the right moment." Her voice lowered to a whisper. "It's said to choose certain people. People who are alone, people who don't belong, and once it chooses you, it never leaves." I shivered at her words, trying to laugh it off. "That's just an old folk tale, right?" Mrs. Jenkins didn't answer, but I could see the fear in her eyes. She quickly changed the subject, but the unease I felt only deepened. The stalker's presence. For the next few days, I tried to shake off the feeling of being watched, but no matter where I went in town, I could always feel eyes on me. At the grocery store, at the park, even at the hospital. It was as though someone was following my every move. Then, one night, it happened again. As I walked home from my shift, I saw him standing there once more, just as he had the first time. But this time he wasn't alone. Behind him, in the shadows, I could make out several other figures, faint, indistinct shapes that seemed to shift and move like smoke. I froze in place, my heart pounding. The man didn't move, but I felt his gaze boring into me, cold and unfeeling. The figures behind him slowly began to close the distance between us, moving silently, like predators stalking their prey. I wanted to run, to scream, but my body refused to obey. It was as though I were paralyzed, trapped in the grip of some unseen force. But just as the figures were about to reach me, a car came speeding down the street, its headlights cutting through the darkness. The figures melted away, and the man in the black coat vanished into the shadows. I ran home as fast as I could, not daring to look back. The final encounter, that night, I bolted all the doors and windows in my cottage. I stayed awake for hours, staring at the darkness outside my window. The feeling of being watched never left. I could hear strange noises in the distance, whispers that seemed to come from nowhere. At dawn, I decided to leave Ashford. I couldn't stay there any longer. As I packed my bags, I glanced out the window, and there he was again. The man in the black coat, standing in the distance, staring up at my window. I felt my breath catch in my throat as the man lifted his hand, slowly pointing at me. And then for the first time I heard his voice, low and guttural, carried on the wind. "You can never leave." I ran out of the house, not looking back until I was miles away. The aftermath. I never returned to Ashford, and I haven't heard from anyone in the town since. But every now and then when I'm alone at night, I hear the whispers again, faint but unmistakable. And I can't shake the feeling that the man is still out there watching me. It's been years now, but I know one thing for sure. The silent watcher never truly leaves you. He waits, always, for the right moment to strike.